Okay. Are we live? Are we live? Hello. I believe we're live. Yeah. Okay. All right. So, if you can't tell, today we're going to be reading the Communist Manifesto, or this fancy title right here. I got my water with me, some Girl Scout cookies, a dream, and words on a paper, or digital paper. And let's go. I just woke up, so I'm really tired. Okay. Manifesto of the Communist Party. A spectra is haunting Europe, the spectra of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to extort this spectra. Pope and Tsar, Metternich and Guizot, French radicals and German police spies. Where is the party in opposition that has not been declared as communistic by its opponents in power? Where is the opposition that has not hurled back the branding reapproach of communism against the more advanced opposition parties as well as against its reactionary adversaries? Two things result from this fact. 1. Communism is already acknowledged by all European powers to be itself a power. 2. It is high time that communism should be openly, in the face of the world, publish their views, their aims, their tendencies, and meet this nursery tale of the spectra of communism with the manifesto of the party itself. To this end, communists of various nations have assembled in London and sketched the following manifesto to be published in English, French, German, Italian, Flemish, and Danish languages, not language. Yeah, because they're all one. Bourgeoisie and proletarians. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Freedom and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmaster, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all these classes, again, subordinate gradations. The modern bourgeoisie society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with this class antagonism. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppressed, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. By bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production, employers of wage labor. By proletarian, the class of modern wage laborers who, having no means of production of their own, are reduced to selling their labor power in order to live. Engels, 1888, English edition. That is, all written history in 1847, the prehistory of society, the social organization existing previous to record, history all but unknown. Since then, August Vox Hansen, Jesus, 1792 to 1866, discovered common ownership of land in Russia. George Ludwig von Mohr provided it to be the social foundation from which all tectonic races started in history, and by, village communities were founded to be, or to have been, the primitive form of society, everywhere from India to Ireland. The inner organization of this primitive communistic society was laid bare, in its typical form, by Lewis Henry Morgan's 1888 to 1886 crowning discovery of the true nature of the gens and its relation to the tribe. With the dissolution of the primeval communities, society begins to be differentiated into separate and finally antagonistic classes. I have attempted to retrace the dissolution in the origin of the family, private property, and the state. Second edition. Stragot, 1886. Engels, 1888, blah, blah, blah. Guildmaster, that is, a full member of guild, a master within, not headed of a guild. Engels, 1888, English edition. Alright. Let's keep it at this big so the stream doesn't compress it. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinct feature. It has simplified class antagonism. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. From the serfs of the Middle Ages sprang the burghers of the earliest towns. From these bourgeoisies, the first elements of bourgeoisie were developed. The discovery of America, the rounding of the Cape, opening up fresh ground for the rising bourgeoisie, the East Indian and Chinese markets, the colonization of America, trade with the colonies, the increase in means of exchange and in commodities generally, gave to commerce, to navigation, to industry, an impulse never known before, and hereby to the revolutionary elements in the to trading feudal society, a rapid development. The feudal system of industry, in which industrial production was monopolized by closing guilds, now no longer sufficed for the growing wants of the new market. The manufacturing system took its place. The guild masters were pushed on one side by manufacturing middle class. Division of labor between the different corporate guilds vanished in the face of division of labor in each single workshop. Meantime, the markets kept ever growing, the demand ever rising. Even manufacture no longer sufficed. Thereupon, steam and machinery revolutionized industrial production. The place of manufacture was taken by the giant. Modern industry, the place of industrial middle class by industrial millionaires, leaders of the whole industrial armies, the modern bourgeois. Yeah, bourgeois. All right. Modern industry has established the world market for which the discovery of America paved the way. This market has given an immense development to commerce, to navigation, to communication by land. This development has, in its turn, reacted on the extension of industry, and in portion as industry, commerce, navigation, railways extension. In the same production, the bourgeoisie developed, increased its capital, and pushed into the background every class handed down from the Middle Ages. We see, therefore, how the modern bourgeoisie is itself the product of a long course of development, of a series of revolutions in the modes of production and of exchange. Each step in the development of the bourgeoisie was accomplished by a corresponding political advance of that class. An oppressed class under the sway of the feudal nobility, an armed and self-governing association in the medieval commune. There's a little star there. This was the name given by their urban communities by the townsmen of Italy and France, after they had purchased or conquered their initial right of self-government from the feudal lords. Commune was the name taken in France by the nascent towns even before they had conquered from their feudal lords and mastered local self-government and political rights at the third estate. Generally speaking, for the economic development of the bourgeoisie, England is here taken as the typical country for its political development. France. For its political development. France. Okay. Stop. Here, independent urban republic, as in Italy and Germany, their taxable third estate of the monarchy, as in France, afterwards, in the period of manufacturing proper, serving either the semi-feudal or the absolute monarchy as a bourgeoisie has at last, since the last establishment of modern industry and of the world market conquered for itself in the modern representative state, exclusive political sway. The executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. The bourgeoisie, where it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, ethical relations. It is pitilessly torn us under the mortally feudal ties, the bondman to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payments. It has drowned the most heavily excavated ecstasies of religion, fervor of chalice enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy waters of egotistical calculation. That is one sentence right there. I gotta give it to them. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of numberless infeasible charter freedoms, has set up the single unconsequential freedom. 1 second. Consequential freedom. Where did I stop? So that's it. Free trade, in one word, for exploitation, viewed by religious and political illusion. It has substituted naked, shameless, direct, brutal exploitation. Once I gotta check the stream, of course, because no one's watching it. I just want to see if people can actually hear volume. Do-do-do. Do-do-do. Alright. Alright, okay. So we're good. The bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its essential veil and has reduced the family to more a mere money relation. 1 second. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show that man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished what I'm looking at the comments. Is conducted. It was as is disclosed the vulgar of the Middle Ages, which actually admired for found blah blah blah. Has been the first to show that man's it has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former excuses, oh Jesus Christ, that's not a word, of nations and crusades. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence for all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbances of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty, and antagonization distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast frozen relations, with their train of ancient and vulnerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new form ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is the holy is profaned. The man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. The need of constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the entire surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. Did no connections was spelled with an X. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in every country. To the great jargon of reactionists, it is drawn from under the feet of industry, the national ground on which it stood. All old established national industries have been destroyed or are daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, whose introduction becomes a life and death question for all civilized nations, by industries that no longer work up ingenious raw material, but raw material draw from the remotest zones. Industries whose products are consumed not only at home, but in every quarter of the globe. In the place of the old wants satisfied by the production of the country, we find new wants, requiring for their satisfaction the production of distant lands and climes. In place of old local and national seclusion and self-sufficiency, we have enclosed in every direction universal interdependence of nations. And, as in material, so also in intellectual production, the intellectual creations of individuals, nations become common property. National one-sidedness and narrow-mindedness become more and more impossible, and from the numerous nation and local literatures there arise a world literature. The bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of communication, draws all, even the most barbarian, nations into civilization. The cheap prices of commodities are the heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls, with which it forces the barbarians' intensely obstinate hatred of foreigners to capitulate. It compels all nations, on pain of extinctions, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their mindset, i.e., to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. The bourgeois has subjected the country to rule of towns. It has created in numerous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life, just as it has made the country dependent on the towns. So it has made barbarians and semi-barbarian countries dependent on the civilized ones. Nations of peasants on nations of bourgeois, the East on the West. The bourgeoisie keeps more and more doing away with the scattered state of the population, of the means of production, and of property. It has allocated population, centralized the means of production, and has concentrated property in a few hands. The necessary consequence of this was political centralis- centralization. Independent or but loosely connected provinces with separate interstates, laws, governments, and systems of taxation became lumped together into one nation with one government, one code of laws, one nation class interest, one frontier, and one customs tariff. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of sacred 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subject of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railroads, electrical telegraphs, grain of whole continents for cultivation, colonization of rivers, whole productions conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? We see then the means of production and of exchange, on those whose foundation the bourgeoisie built itself up, were generated in feudal society at a certain stage in which development of these means of production and of exchange, the conditions under which feudal society produced and exchanged. Wait, which produced and exchanged. The feudal organization of agriculture and manufacturing industry. In one word, the feudal relation of property became no longer compatible with the already developed productive forces. They became so many fetters. They had to be burst asunder. They were burst asunder. No idea what that means. Into their place stepped free competition, accompanied by a social and political constitution adapted in it, and the economic and political sway of the bourgeois class. A similar movement is going on before our own eyes. Modern bourgeois society, with its relations of production, of exchange, and of property, a society that has conjured up such gigantic means of production and of exchange, is like the sorcerer who is no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld, whom he has called up by his spells. For many, a decade past, the history of industry and commerce is but the history of the revolt of modern productive forces against modern conditions of production, against the proprietary relations that are conditions for the existence of the bourgeois and of its rule. It is enough to mention the commercial crisis that by their periodical return put the existence of the entire bourgeois class society on its trail, each time more threatening. In these crises, a great part not only of the existing products, but also of the previously created productive forces are periodically destroyed. In these crises, there breaks out an epidemic that, in all earlier epochs, would have seen an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarianism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, has cut off the supply of every means of substance. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of substance, too much industry, too much commerce. The productive forces at the disposal of society no longer tend to further the development of the conditions of bourgeois property. On the contrary, they have become too powerful for these conditions, by which they are feathered. What does feathered even mean? And so soon as they overcome these fetters, they bring disorder into the whole of bourgeois society, endanger the existence of bourgeois property. The conditions of bourgeois society are too narrow to compromise the wealth created by them. And how does the bourgeois get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces. On the other hand, by the conquest of new markets, and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for a more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented. The weapons with which the bourgeoisie felled feudalism to the ground are now turned against the bourgeoisie itself. 1 second, I'm gonna eat a snack. Just had to eat some Girl Scout cookies, and we're back. But not only has the bourgeoisie forced the weapons that bring death to itself, it has also called into existence the men who are to wield those weapons, the modern working class, the proletarians. In proportion, as the bourgeoisie, i.e., capital, is developed, in the same proportion is the proletariat, the modern working class, developed a class of laborers who live only so long as they find work, and who find work only so long as their labor increases capital. These laborers who must sell themselves piecemeal are a commodity, like every other article of commerce, and are consequently exposed to all the vicissitudes of competition, to all the fluctuations of the market. Owing to the extensive use of machinery and to the division of labor, the work of the proletarians has lost all individual character, and consequently all charm for the workman. He becomes an appendage of the machine, and it is only the most simple, most monotonous, and most easily acquired knack that is required of him. Hence the cost of production of a workman is restricted almost entirely to the means of substance that he requires for maintenance and for the protagonization of his race. But the price of a commodity, and therefore also of labor, is equal to its cost of production. In proportion, therefore, as a repulsiveness of the work increases, the wage decreases. Nay, more, in the proportion as the use of machinery and division of labor increases, in the same proportion the burden of toil also increases, whether by prolongation of the working hours, by the increase of work exact in a given time, or by increased speed of machinery, etc. Modern industry has converted the little workshop of the patriarchal master into the great factory of the industrial capitalist. Masses of laborers, crowded into the factory, are organized like soldiers. As private of the industrial army, they are placed under the command of a perfect hierarchy of officers and sergeants. Not only are they slaves of the bourgeoisie class and of the bourgeoisie state, they are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine, by the overlook, and above all, by the individual bourgeois manufacturer himself. The more openly this despotism proclaims gain to be its end and aim, the more petty, the more hateful, and the more embittering it is. The less skill and exertion of strength implied in manual labor, in other words, the more modern industry becomes developed, the more is the labor of men superseded by that of women. Differences of age and sex have no longer any distinctive social validity for the working class. Differences of age and sex. Oh, oopsies, I just reread a line. Okay. All are instruments of labor, more or less expensive to use, according to their age and sex. No sooner is the exploitation of the labors by manufacturers so far at an end that he receives his wages in cash, that he is set upon by other proportions of bourgeoisie, the landlord, the shopkeeper, the pawnbroker, etc. The lower strata of middle class, the small trade people, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen, generally the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale on which modern industry is carried on, and swarmed in the competition with the large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by new methods of production. Thus, the proletariat is recruited from all classes of the population. The proletariat goes through various stages of development. It, with it, birth begins its struggle with the bourgeoisie. At first, the contest is carried on by individual laborers, then by the work people of a factory, then by the operative of one trade in one locality against the individual bourgeois who directly exploits them. They direct their attacks not against the bourgeois conditions of production, but against the instruments of production themselves. They destroy imported wares that compete with their labor. They smash to pieces machinery. They set factories ablaze. They seek to restore by force the vanished status of workmen of Middle Ages. 1 second, I got a cough. I'm kind of dying. At this stage, the laborers still form an incoherent mass scattered over the whole country and broken up by their mutual competition. If anywhere they unite to form more compact bodies, this is not yet the consequence of their own active union, but of the union of the bourgeoisie, which class, in order to attain its own political ends, is compelled to set the whole proletariat in motion, and is moreover yet for a time able to do so. At this stage, therefore, the proletarians do not fight their enemies, but the enemies of their enemies, the remnants of absolute monarchy, the landowners, the non-industrial bourgeois, the petty bourgeois. Thus, the whole historical movement is contradicted in the hands of the bourgeoisie. Every victory so obtained is a victory for the bourgeoisie. But with the development of industry, the proletariat not only increases in number, it becomes concentrated in greater masses. Its strength grows, and it feels that strength more. The various interests and conditions of life within ranks of the proletariat are more and more equalized in proportion as machinery obliterates all distinctions of labor, and nearly everywhere reduces wages to the same low level. The growing competition among the bourgeois and the resulting commerce crises make the wages of workers even more fluctuating. The increasing improvement of machinery, ever more rapidly developing, makes their livelihood more and more precarious. The collisions between individual workmen and individual bourgeois take more and more the character of collisions between two classes. Thereupon, the workers began to form combinations, trade unions, against the bourgeois. They clubbed together in order to keep up the rate of wages. They found permanent associations in order to make provisional beforehand for these occasional revolts. Here and here, the contest breaks out into riots. Now and then, the workers are victorious, but only for a time. The real fruit of their battle lies, not in the immediate result, but in the ever-expanding union of the workers. This union is helped on by the improved means of communication that are created by modern industry, and that place the workers of different localities in contact with one another. It was just this contact that was needed to centralize the numerous local struggles, all of the same character, into one national struggle between classes. But every class struggle is a political struggle, and that union to attain which the burghers of Middle Ages, with their miserable highways, required centuries, the modern proletarian, thanks to railways, achieved in a few years. This organization of the proletarians into a class and consequently into a political party is continually being upset again by the competition between the workers themselves. But it ever rises up again, stronger, firmer, mightier. It compels legislative recognition of particular interest of the workers by taking advantage of the divisions among the bourgeoisie itself. Thus, the 10-hour bill in England was carried. Altogether, collisions between the classes of the older society further, in many ways, the course of the development of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie finds itself involved in a constant battle, at first with the aristocracy, later on with those portions of the bourgeoisie itself, whose interests have become antagonistic to the progress of industry. At all time with the bourgeoisie of foreign countries, in all these battles, it sees itself compelled to appeal to the proletariat, to ask for help, and thus to drag it into the political arena. The bourgeoisie itself, therefore, supplies the proletariat with its own element of political and general education. In other words, it furnishes the proletariat with weapons for fighting the bourgeoisie. I really need to stop coughing. I still got a lot more pages to go. Further, as we have already seen, entire sections of the ruling class are, by the advance of industry, precipitated into the proletariat, or are at least threatened in their conditions of existence. These also supply the proletariat with fresh elements of enlightenment and progress. Finally, in times when the class struggle nears this decisive hour, the progress of dissolution going on within the ruling class, in fact, within the whole range of old society, assumes such a violent, glaring character that a small section of ruling class cuts itself adrift and joins the revolutionary class, the class that holds the future in its hands. Just as, therefore, at an earlier period, a section of the nobility went over to the bourgeoisie, so now a portion of the bourgeoisie goes over to the proletariat, and in particular, a portion of the bourgeoisie ideologists who have raised themselves to the level of comprehending theoretically the historical movement as a whole. Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from their extinction their existence as fraction of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are only so in their view of impending transfer into the proletariat. They Jesus. They thus defend not only their present but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. The dangerous class, lumpentant proletariat, the social scum, that passive, rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of the old society, may, here and there, be swept into the movement by a proletariat revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue. In the condition of the proletariat, those of old society at large are virtually swamped. The proletarian is without property. His relation to his wife and children has no longer anything in common with the bourgeoisie family relations. Modern industry labor, modern subjective to capital, the same in England as in France, in the American as in Germany, has stripped him of every trace of national character. Law, morality, religion are to him so many bourgeois prejudices, behind which lurk in ambush just as many bourgeois interests. As the preceding classes that got the upper hand sought to fortify their already acquired status by subjecting society at large to their conditions of appropriation, the proletarians cannot become masters of the productive forces of society, except by abolishing their own previous mode of appropriation, and thereby also every other previous mode of appropriation. They have nothing of their own to secure and to fortify. Their mission is to destroy all previous securities for an insurance of individual property. All previous historical movements of minorities or in the interest of minorities, the proletarian movement is the self-conscious, independent movement of the immense majority, in the interest of the immense majority. The proletariat, the lowest stratum of the present society, cannot stir, cannot raise itself up, without the whole succumbent strata of official society being sprung into the air. Though not in substance, yet in the form, the struggle of the proletariat with the bourgeoisie is at first a national struggle. The proletariat of each country must, of course, first of all settle matters with its own bourgeoisie. In depicting the most general phases of the development of the proletariat, we trace the more or less vicid civil war raging within existing society, up to the point where the war breaks out into open revolution, and where the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie lays the foundation for the sway of the proletariat. Hitherto, every form of society has been based, as we have already seen, on the antagonism of oppressed and oppressed classes. But in order to oppress a class, certain conditions must be assured to it under which it can, at least, continue its slavish existence. The serf, in the period of serfdom, raised himself to membership in the commune, just as the petty bourgeois, under the yoke of feudal abolition, managed to develop into a bourgeois. The modern laborer, on the contrary, instead of rising with the process of industry, sinks deeper and deeper below the conditions of existence of his own class. He becomes a pauper, and the pauperism develops more rapidly than population and wealth. And here it becomes evident that the bourgeoisie is unfit any longer to be the ruling class in society, and to oppose its conditions of existence upon society as an overriding law. It is unfit to rule because it is incompetent to assure an existence to its slave within his slavery, because it cannot help letting him sink into such a state that it has to feed him instead of being fed by him. Society can no longer live under this bourgeoisie. In other words, its existence is no longer compatible with society. The essential conditions for the existence and for the sway of the bourgeois class is the formation and augmentation of capital. The condition for capital is wage labor. Wage labor rests exclusively on competition between the laborers. The advance of industry, whole involuntary promoter is the bourgeoisie, replaces the isolation of the laborers due to competition by the revolutionary combination due to this association. The development of modern industry, therefore, cuts from under its feet the very foundation on which the bourgeois produces and appropriates products. What the bourgeois therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. Alright, we're on chapter 2. I'm going to take a quick break and go die. Just kidding. Alrighty, let's hit chapter 2. Proletarians and communists. In what relation do communists stand to the proletarians as a whole? The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole. They do not set up any sectarian principles of their own. Okay, I just messed up that word. By which to shape and mold the proletarian movement. The communists are distinguished from the other working class parties by this only: 1. In the national struggle of the proletarian of the different countries, they point out and bring to the front the common interest of the entire proletariat, independently of all nationality. 2. In the various stages of development which the struggle of the working class against the bourgeois has to pass through, they always and everywhere represent the interest of the movement as a whole. The communists, therefore, are on the one hand practically the most advanced and resolute section of the working class parties of every country, that section which pushes forward all others. On the other hand, theoretically, they have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions, and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The immediate aim of the communist is the same as that of all other proletarian parties: formation of the proletarian into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, and conquest of political power by the proletariat. The theoretical conclusions of the communists are in no way based on ideas or principles that have been invented or discovered by this or that would-be universal reformer. They merely express, in general terms, actual relations springing from an existing class struggle, from a historical movement going on under our very eyes. The abolition of existing proprietary relations is not at all a distinctive feature of communism. All property relations in the past have continually been subjected to historical change, consequently upon the change in historical conditions. The French Revolution, for example, abolished feudal property in favor of bourgeois property. The distinguished feature of communism is not the abolition of property generally, but the abolition of bourgeois property. But modern bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products. That is based on class antagonism, on the exploitation of the many by the few. In this sense, the theory of communism may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. We communists have been reapproached with the desire of abolishing the right of personally acquiring property as the fruit of a man's own labor, which property is alleged to be the groundwork of all personal freedom, activity, and independence. Hard-won, self-acquired, self-earned property. Do you mean the property of petty artisan and of the small peasant, a form of property that precedes the bourgeois form? There's no need to abolish that. The development of industry has a great extent already destroyed it, and is still destroying it daily. Or do you mean the modern bourgeois private property? But does wage labor create any property for the laborers? Not a bit. It creates capital, i.e., that kind of property which exploits wage labor, and which cannot increase except upon conditions of begetting a new supply of wage labor for fresh exploitation. Property in its present form is based on the antagonism of capital and wage labor. Let us examine both sides of this antagonism. To be a capitalist is to have only a purely personal but a social status in production. Capital is a collective product, and only by the united action of many members, nay, in the last resort, only by the united action of all members of society, can it be set into motion. Capital is therefore not only personal, it is a social power. When therefore capital is converted into common property, into the property of all members of society, personal property is not thereby transformed into social property. It is only the social character of the property that is changed. It loses its class character. Let us now take wage labor. The average price of wage labor is minimum wage, i.e., that quantum of means of substance which is absolutely requested to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, wage laborers appropriate by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence. We by no means intend to abolish this personal appropriation of the product of labor, an appropriation that is made for maintenance and reproduction of human life, and that leaves no surplus wherewith to command the labor of others. All that we want to do with is the measurable character of this appropriation, under which the laborer lives merely to increase capital, and is allowed to live only in so far as the interest of the ruling class requires it. In bourgeois society, living labor is but a means to increase accumulative labor. In communist society, accumulative labor is but a means to widen, to enrich, to promote the existence of the laborer. In bourgeois society, therefore, the past dominates the present. The past dominates the present. In communist society, the present dominates the past. In bourgeois society, capital is independent and has individuality, while the living person is dependent and has no individuality. And the abolition of this state of things is called by the bourgeois abolition of individuality and freedom, and rightly so. The abolition of bourgeois individuality, bourgeois independence, and bourgeois freedom is absolutely aimed at it, and undoubtedly aimed at it. Jesus, I'm messing up on a lot of words. Sorry about that. By freedom is meant, under the present bourgeois conditions of production, free trade, free selling and buying. But if selling and buying disappears, free selling and buying disappears also. This talk about the free selling and buying, and all the other brave words of our bourgeois about freedom in general, have a meaning, if any, only in contrast with restricted selling and buying, with the feathered traders of the Middle Ages, but have no means when opposed to the communistic abolition of buying and selling, of the bourgeois conditions of production, and the bourgeoisie itself. You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property, but in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. You reproach us, therefore, with the intending to do away with a form of property, the necessary condition for whose existence is the non-existence of any property for the immense majority of society. In one word, you reproach us when intending to do away with your property. Prospectively so, that is just what we intend. from the moment when our labor can no longer be converted into capital money or rent, into a social power capable of being monopolized, i.e., from the moment when an individual property can no longer be transformed into bourgeois property, into capital, from that moment, you can say individuality vanishes. You must therefore confess that by individual you mean no other person than the bourgeois, than the middle class owner of property. This person must indeed be swept out of the way and made impossible. Communism deprives no man of the power to appropriate the products of society. All that it does is to deprive him of the power to subjugate the labor of others by means of such appropriations. It has been objected that upon the abolition of private property, all work will cease, and universal laziness will overtake us. According to this, bourgeois society ought long live to have gone to the dogs through sheer idleness, for those who its members who work acquire nothing, and those who acquire anything do not work. The whole of this objection is but another expression of the tautology, that there can no longer be any wage labor when there is no longer any capital. All objections urged against the communistic model of production and appropriating material products have in the same way been urged against the communistic mode of producing and appropriating intellectual products. Just as, to the bourgeois, the disappearance of class property is the disappearance of production itself, so the disappearance of class structure is to him identical with the disappearance of all culture. That culture, the loss of which he laments, is, for the enormous majority, a mere training to act as a machine. But don't wrangle with us so long as you apply to our intended abolition of bourgeois property the standard of your bourgeois notations of freedom, culture, law, ECT, etc. Your very ideas are but the outgrowth of the conditions of your bourgeois production and bourgeois property, just as your jurisprudence is but the will of the class made into a law for all, a will whose essential character and direction are determined by the economical conditions of existence of your class. The selfish misconception that induces you to transform the case of adjacent property or ancient property, what you admit in the case of feudal property, you are of course forbidding to admit in the case of your own bourgeois form of property. Abolition of the family. Even the most radical flare up at this infamous proposal of the communists. On the foundation is the present family, the bourgeois family based on capital, on private gain. In its completely developed form, this family exists only among the bourgeoisie, but this state of things finds its completement in the practical absence of the family among the proletarians and in public proposition. The bourgeois family will vanish as a matter of course when its complete vanishes, and both will vanish with the vanishing of capital. I just said the word vanish 3 times in one sentence. That confused me. Do you charge us with wanting to stop the exploitation of children by their parents? To this crime we plead guilty. But you say we destroyed most hallowed of relations when we replaced home education by social, and your education. Not that also social, and determined by social conditions under which you educate, by the intervention, direct or indirect, of society by means of school, etc. The communists have not invented the invention of society and education. They do but seek to alter the character of that invention, and to reduce education from the influence of the ruling class. The bourgeois claptrap. What? Okay, that caught me off guard. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hollow correlations of parents and child, becomes all the more disgusting, the more, by the action of modern industry, all the family ties among the proletarians are torn asunder, and their children transformed into simple articles of commerce and instruments of labor. But you communists would introduce community of women, screams the bourgeoisie in chorus. The bourgeois sees his wife a mere instrument of production. He hears that instruments of production are to be exploited in common, and naturally can come to no other conclusion that the lot of being common to all will likewise fall to women. He is not even a suspicion that the real point aimed at is to do away with the status of women as mere instruments of production. For the rest, nothing is more ridiculous than the virtuous indignation of our bourgeois at the community of women which they pretend is to be openly and officially established by the communists. The communists have no need to introduce community of women. It has existed almost from the immemorial. Okay, let's just continue on. I'll learn how to say that word later. Immemorial. Okay, I'm just gonna go on. Our bourgeois, not content with having wives and daughters of their proletarians at their disposal, not to speak of common prostitutes, take the greatest pleasure in seducing each other's wives. Bourgeois marriage is, in reality, a system of wives in common, and thus, at the most, what the communists might possibly be reapproaching with is that they desire to introduce, in substitution for a hypothetical concealed and openly legalized community of women. For the rest, it is a self-evident that the abolition of the present system of production must bring with it the abolition of the community of women springing from the system, i.e., of prostitution both public and private. The communists are further reapproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got, since the proletariat must first of all acquire political supremacy, must rise to be the leading class in the nation, must constitute itself the nation. It is so far itself national, no, though not in bourgeois sense of the word. National differences and antagonism between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of bourgeoisie, to the freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and conditions of life corresponding hitherto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster. United action of the leading civilized countries, at least, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. In proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another will also be put to an end, the exploitation of one nation by another will also be put to an end. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. The charges against communism made from a religious, a philosophical, and generally from an ideological standpoint are not deserving of serious examination. Does it require deep institution to comprehend that man's ideas, views, and conception, in one word, man's consciousness, changes everything with every change in the condition of his material existence, in his social relations, and in his social life? What else does this history of ideas prove than the intellectual production changes its character in proportion as material production is changed? The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. When people speak of the ideas that revolutionize society, they do but express the fact that within the old society, the elements of a new one have been created, and that the dissolution of the old ideas keeps even pace with the dissolution of the old conditions of existence. Hmm? Where was I? Oh. When the ancient world was in its last throes, the ancient religions were overcome by Christianity. When Christian ideas succumbed in the 18th century to rationalist ideas, feudal society fought its death battle with the then revolutionary bourgeoisie. The ideas of religious liberty and freedom are consequence merely gave express to this way of free competition within the domain of knowledge. Undoubtedly, it will be said, religious, moral, philosophical, and judicial ideas have been modified in the course of historical development. But religion, morality, philosophy, political science, and law constantly survive this change. There are, besides eternal truths such as freedom, justice, etc., that are common of all states of society. But communism abolishes eternal truths. It abolishes all religion and all morality. Instead of constituting them on a new basis, it therefore acts in contradiction to all past historical experience. What does this accusation reduce itself to? The history of all past society has consisted in the development of class antagonism that has assumed different forms of different epochs. But whatever form they may have taken, one fact is common to all past pages, viz. What's a viz? Can I see what a viz is? Nope. The exploitation of one part of society by the other. No wonder, then, that the social consciousness of past ages, despite all the multiplicity and variety it displays, moves within certain common forms of general ideas, which cannot completely vanish except with the total disappearance of class antagonism. The Communist Revolution is the most radical rupture with traditional proprietary relations. No wonder that its development involved the most radical rupture with traditional ideas. But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism. We have seen above that the first step in revolution by the working class is to rise the proletariat to the position of ruling class to win the battle of democracy. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degree, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the... Did I just... Where was I? I.e., of the proletariat organization as the ruling class, and to increase the total productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means. One second. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by the means of despotic inroads on the rights of property and on the conditions of bourgeois production, by the means of measures, therefore, which appears economically insufficient and untangible, but which in the course of the movement outstrips themselves, necessitates further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means sorry. Da, da, da. By means of measures, therefore, which appears economically insufficient and intangible, blah blah blah, blah blah blah. Outstrips themselves, necessitate further inroads upon the old social order, and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. These measures will, of course, be different in different countries. These measures will, nevertheless, in the most advanced countries, the following will be pretty generally acceptable. 1. Abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. 2. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Okay. 3. Abolition of all rights of inheritance. 1 second. I gotta be right back. Alright. 4. Confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. 5. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and exclusive monopoly. 6. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. 7. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wasteland, and the improvement of the soil, generally in accordance with a common plan. 8. Equal liberty of all to work. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. 9. Combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of all distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the populace over the country. And 10. Free education for all children in public schools. Abolition of children's factory labor in its present form. Combination of education with industrial production. ECT. I would assume that's what it says. When in the course of development, class distinctions have disappeared and all production has been concentrated in the hands of a vast association of the whole nation, the public power will lose its political character. Political power, properly so called, is merely the organization of one class for oppressing one another. Back again. If the proletariat during its contestant with the bourgeoisie is compelled by the force of circumstances to organize itself as a class, if, by means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and as such sweeps away by the force the old conditions of production, then it will, along with these conditions, have swept away the conditions for the existence of class antagonism and of classes generally, and will thereby have abolished its own supremacy as a class. In place of the old bourgeois society, with its classes and class antagonism, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. Alright, take a quick break, even though I just paused so many times. Get some Girl Scout cookies. Alright. 3. Socialist and Communist Literature. Or I don't know. 1. Reactionary Socialism. A. Feudal Socialism. Owing to their historical position, it has become the vocation of the aristocracies of French and England to write pamphlets against modern bourgeois society. In the French Revolution of July in 1830 and in the English Reform agitation These aristocracies again succumbed to the hateful upstart. There henceforth a serious political struggle was altogether out of the question. A literacy battle alone remained possible. Okay. Uh, Possible. But even in the domain of literature, the old crises of the Restoration period has become impossible. In order to arouse sympathy, the aristocracy was obligated to lose sight, apparently, of its own interest, and to formulate their indictment against the bourgeoisie in the interest of the exploited working class alone. Thus, the aristocracy took their revenge by singing lampoons on their new masters and whispered in his ear sinister prophecies of coming catastrophe. In this way arose feudal socialism, half lamentation, half lampoon, half an echo of the past, half menace of the future. As times by its bitter, witty, and incisive criticisms, striking the bourgeoisie to the very heart's core, but always ludicrous in its effect. Ludicrous in its effect, though total incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history. The aristocracy, in order to rally the people to them, waved the proletarians' alms bag in front for a banner, but the people, so often as it joined them, saw on the hindquarters the old feudal coat of arms, and deserted with loud and irrelevant laughter. One section of the French legitimist and youth England exhibited this spectacle. In pointing out their mode of exploitation was different to that of the bourgeoisie, the feudalists forgot that they exploited under circumstances and conditions that were quite different and that are now antiquated. Jesus, I can't read words. Now antiquated. In showing that, under their rule, the modern proletariat never existed. They forgot that modern bourgeoisie is the necessary offspring of their own form of society. For the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism that their chief accusation against the bourgeois amounts to this: that under the bourgeoisie regime, a class is being developed which is designated to cut up, root, and branch the older order of society. 1 second. Where did I leave off? Blah blah blah. Let's see for the rest, so little do they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism that their chief accusation against the bourgeoisie amounts to this: that under the bourgeois regime, a class is being developed which is designated to cut up, root, and branch the older order of society. What they upbraid the bourgeoisie with is not so much that it creates a proletariat as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat. In political practice, therefore, they join in all corrosive measures against the working class, and in ordinary life, despite their high Fulton phrases, they stood up. Jesus, I'm gonna take a quick breather. They stood to pick up the golden apples dropped from the tree of industry, and to barter truth, love, and honor for traffic in wool, beer-root sugar, and potato spirits. There's a little mark. Not the English Restoration, but the French Restoration, yep. This applies chiefly to Germany, where the landed aristocracy and squilarchy have large positions of their estate cultivated for their own account by stewards, and are, moreover, extensive beer root sugar manufacturers and distillers of potato spirits. The wealthier British aristocracies are, as yet, rather above that, but they, too, know how to make up for declining rents by lending their names to floaters, or more or less shady joint stock companies. As the parson has ever gone hand in hand with the landlord, so the clerical socialism with feudal socialism. Nothing is easier than to give Christian I don't know that word, asceticism a socialist tinge. Has not Christianity declaimed against private property, against marriage, against the state? Has it not preached in the place of these charity and poverty, celibacy and mortification of the flesh, monastic life and mother church? Christian society is but the holy water with which the priest concentrates the heart burning of the aristocracy. 1 second. Petty bourgeois socialism. The feudal aristocracy was not the only class that was ruined by the bourgeoisie, not the only class whose conditions of existence pinned and perished in the atmosphere of modern bourgeois society. The medieval burgesses and the small peasant proprietors were the prosecutors of the modern bourgeoisie. In those countries which are but little developed, industrially and commercially, these two classes still vegetate side by side with the rising bourgeoisie. In countries where modern civilization has become fully developed, a new class of petty bourgeois has been formed, fluctuating between proletariat and bourgeoisie, and ever renewing itself as a supplementary part of bourgeois society. The individual members of this class, however, are being constantly hurled down into the proletariat by the action of the competition. And as modern industry develops, they even see the moment approaching when they will completely disappear as an independent section of modern society, to be replaced in manufactures, agriculture, and commerce by overlookers, bailiffs, and shopmen. In countries like France, where the peasants constitute far more than half the population, it was natural that writers who sided with the proletariat against the bourgeoisie should use, in their criticisms of the bourgeois regime, the standard of the peasants and petty bourgeois, and from the standpoint of these intermediate classes, should take up the cuddles for the working class. Don't know what that means. Thus arose petty bourgeois socialism. Sismondi was the head of this school, not only in France, but also in England. This school of socialism desiccated with great acuteness the contradictions in the conditions of modern production. It laid bare the hypothetical apologies of economicists. Yes. It proved incontrovertibly the disastrous effects of machinery and division of labor, the concentrations of capital and land in a few hands, overproduction, and crises. It pointed out that the inevitable ruin of the petty bourgeois and peasant, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy in production, the crying inequalities in the distribution of wealth, the industrial war of experimentation between extermination between nations, the dissolution of old moral bonds, of the old family relations, of the old nationalities. In its positive aims, however, this form of socialism aspires either to restoring the old means of production and of exchange, and with them the old proprietary relations and the old society, or to cramming the modern means of production and of exchange with the framework of the old property relations that have been, and were bound to be, exploited by those means. In either case, it is both reactionary and utopian. Its last words are cooperate guilds for manufacture, patriarchal relations in agriculture. Ultimately, when stubborn historical facts had disappeared, all intoxicating effects of self deception, this form of socialism ended in a miserable fit of the blues. German or true socialism. The socialist and communist literature of France, a literature that originated under the pressure of a bourgeois power, and that was the expression of the struggle against this power, was introduced into Germany at a time when the bourgeoisie in that country had just begun its contest with feudal absolutism. German philosophers would be philosophers, and Buick's esprits, men of literature, eagerly seized on this literature, only forgetting that when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them. In contact with Germany's social conditions, this French literature lost all its immediate practical significance and assumed a purely literary aspect. Thus, to the German philosophers of the 18th century, the demands of the First French Revolution were nothing more than the demands of the practical reason. In general, and in utterance of the will of the revolutionary French bourgeoisie significance, in their eyes, the laws of pure will, of will as it was bound to be, of true human will generally. The work of German literati consisted solely in the bringing the new France ideas into harmony with their ancient philosophical conscience, or rather, in annexing the French ideas without deserting their own philosophic points of view. This annexation took place in the same way in which a foreign language is appropriated, namely by translation. It is well known how the monks wrote silly lives of Catholic saints over the manuscripts on which the classical works of ancient Heatherem had been written. The German literati reserved this process with the profane French literature. They wrote their philosophical nonsense beneath the French original. For instance, beneath the French criticism of the economic functions of money, they wrote alienation of humanity, and beneath the French criticism of the bourgeois state, they wrote dethronement of the category of the general, and so forth. The introduction of these philosophical phrases at the back of French historical criticisms they dubbed philosophy of action, true socialism, German science of socialism, philosophical foundation of socialism, and so on. The French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated, and since it ceased in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with the other, he felt conscious of having overcome French one-sidedness, and of representing not true requirements, but the requirements of truth, not the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of human nature, of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. This German socialism, which took its schoolboy task so seriously and solemnly, and extolled its poor stock in trade in such a mountebank fashion, meanwhile gradually lost its pedantic innocence. The fight of Germans, and especially of the Prussian bourgeoisie, against feudal aristocracy and absolute monarchy, in other words, the liberal movement, became more earnest. By this way, the long wishes for opportunity was offered to true socialism of confronting the political movement with the socialist demands, of hurling their traditional anthems against liberalism, against representative government, against bourgeois competition, bourgeois freedom of the press, bourgeois legislation, bourgeois liberty and equality, and the preaching to the masses that they had nothing to gain and everything to lose. By this bourgeois movement, German socialism forgot, in the nick of time, that the French criticism, whose silly echo it was, presupposed the existence of modern bourgeois society with its corresponding economic conditions of existence, and the political condition adapted hitherto. The very things, those attainments, was the objects of the pending struggle in Germany. To the absolute Germans, with their following of parsons, professors, country squires, and officials, it served as a welcome scarecrow against the threatening bourgeoisie. It was a sweet finish after the bitter pills of flogging and bullets, with which these same governments, just at that time, dosed the German working class risings. While this true socialism thus served the government as a weapon for fighting the German bourgeoisie, it, at the same time, directly represented a reactionary interest, the interest of German Philistines. In Germany, the petty bourgeois class, a relic of the 16th century, and since then constantly cropping up again under the various forms, is the real social basis of the existing state of things. To preserve this class is to preserve the existing state of things in Germany. The industrial and political supremacy of the bourgeoisie threatens it with certain destruction. On the other hand, from the concentration of capital, on the other, from the rise of revolutionary proletariat. True socialism appears to kill these two birds with one stone. It spread like an epidemic. The robe of speculative cobweb embroiders with flowers of rhetoric, steeped in the dew of sickly sentiment. This this transcendent robe in which Germany's socialists wrap their sorry eternal truce, all skin and bone, severed to wonderfully increase the sale of their goods amongst such a public. And its part, German socialism recognized more and more its own calling as the bombastic representative of the petty bourgeois Philistine. It proclaimed the German nation to be the model nation, and the Germany petty Philistine to be the typical man. To every malicious meanness of this model man, it gave a hidden, higher socialistic interpretation, the exact contrary of its real character. It went to the extreme length of directly opposing the brutally destructive tendencies of communism, and of proclaiming its supreme and impartial contempt of all class struggles, with very few exceptions. All the so-called socialist and communist publications that now, 1847, accumulate in Germany belong to the domain of this foul and invading literature. 2. Conservative and bourgeois socialism. A part of the bourgeoisie is desirous of redressing social grievances in order to secure the continued existence of bourgeois society. To this section belong economist, philanthropist, humanitarianist, improver of the condition of the working class, organizers of charity, members of society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fantasies, fanatics, hole and corner reform of every imaginable kind. This form of socialism has, moreover, been worked out into complete systems. We may cite Proudhon's Philosophie de la Misère as an example of this form. The socialistic bourgeois wants all the advantages of modern social conditions without the struggles and dangers necessarily resulting therefrom. They desire the existing state of society minus its revolutionary and disintegrating elements. They wish for a bourgeoisie without a proletariat. The bourgeoisie naturally convinces the world in which it is supreme to be the best, and bourgeois socialism develops this comfortable conception into various more or less complete systems. In, a, in requiring the proletariat to carry out such a system, and thereby to march straightway into the social New Jerusalem. Jerusalem, okay. It but requires in reality that the proletariat should remain within the bounds of existing society, but should cast away all its hateful ideas considering the bourgeoisie. A second and more practical, but less systematic form of socialism sought to deprecate every revolutionary movement in the eyes of the working class by showing that no mere political reform, but only a change in material conditions of existence in economic relations could be of any advantage to them. By changes in the material conditions of existence, this form of socialism, however, by no means understands abolition of the bourgeois relations of production, an abolition that can be effected only by a revolution, but administrative reforms based on the continued existence of these relations. Reforms, therefore, that is not respect affect the relations between capital and labor, but at the best lessens the cost and simplifies the administrative work of bourgeois government. The star was somewhere. The Revolutionary Storm of 1848 swept away this whole shabby tendency and cured its protagonists of the desire to dabble in socialism. The chief representative and classical type of this tendency is Mr. Karl Grunen. Bourgeois socialism attains adequate expression when, and only, it becomes a mere figure of speech. Free trade for the benefit of the working class, protective duties for the benefit of the working class, prison reforms for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only seriously meant word of bourgeois socialism. It is summed up in the phrase, the bourgeois is the bourgeois for the benefit of the working class. Critical utopian socialism and communism. We do not here refer to the literature which, in every great modern revolutions, has always given voice to the demands of proletariat, such as the writings of Biaf and others. The first direct attempt of the proletariat to attain its own ends made in time the universal excitement when feudal society was being overthrown. I just love it that I have family in my house. Creates all the noise. Right. And I create noise. I'm just gonna start from the beginning. We done blah blah. The first direct attempt of the proletariat to attain its own ends, made in time of universal excitement, when feudal society was being overthrown, necessarily failed, owing to the then undeveloped stage of the proletariat, as well to the obscene of the economic conditions for its emancipation, conditions that have yet to be produced, and could be produced by the impending bourgeois epoch alone. The revolutionary literature that accompanied these first movements of the proletariat had necessarily a reactionary character. It, include, it included universal assystemum and social leveling in its crudest form. The social and communist systems, properly so called, those of Saint Simon, Fourier, Owen, and others, springs into existence in the early undeveloped period described above of the struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie. See section 1, bourgeoisie and proletarians. The founders of these systems see, indeed, the class antagonism as well as the action of the decomposing elements in the prevailing form of society. But the proletariat, as yet in its infancy, offers to them the spectacle of a class without any historical initiative or any independent political movement. Since the development of class antagonism keeps every pace with the development of industry, the economic situation as they find it does not as yet offer to them the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. They therefore search after a new social science, after new social laws to create these conditions. Historical action is to yield to their personal inventive action. Historically created conditions of emancipation to fantastic ones, and the gradually spontaneous class organization of the proletariat to an organization of socially society, especially contrived by these inventors. Future history resolves itself, in their eyes, to the propaganda and the practical carrying out of their social plans. In the formation of their plans, they are conscious of caring chiefly for the interest of the working class, as being the most suffering class. Only from the point of view of being the most suffering class does the proletariat exist for them. The undeveloped state of class struggle, as well as their own surroundings, cause socialists as this kind of to consider themselves far superior to all class antagonism. They wanted to improve the condition of every member of society, even that of the most favored. Hence, they habitually appealed to society at large without the distinction of class. Love family members, yes. Nay, by preference to the ruling class. So how can people, when once they understand their system, fail to see it is in it the best possible plan of the best possible state of society. Hence, they reject all political and especially all revolutionary action. They wish to attain their ends by peaceful means, necessarily doomed to failure, and by the force of example to pave the way for the new social gospel. Such fantastic pictures of future society, painted at a time when the proletariat, still in a very underdeveloped state, and has but a fantastic conception of its own position, corresponding with the first instinctive yearnings of that class for a general reconstruction of society. But these socialist and communist publications contain also a critical element. They attack every principle of existing society. Hence, they are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. The practical measures proposed in them, such as the abolition of the distinction between town and country, of the family, of the carrying on of industries for the account of private individuals, and of the wage system, the proclamation of social harmony, the conversation of the function of state into a more super independence of production. All these proposals point solely to the disappearance of class antagonism, which were at that time only just cropping up, and which in these publications are recognized in their earliest instinct and undefined forms only. These proposals, therefore, are a purely utopian character. The, the significance of critical utopian socialism and communism bears an immense relation to historical development. In proposition as the modern class struggle develops and takes definite shape, this fantastic standing apart from the contest, these fantastic attacks on it lose all practical value and all theoretical justification. Therefore, although the organizers of these systems were in many respects revolutionary, their disciplines have, in every case, formed merely reactionary sects. They hold fast by the original views of their masters, in opposition to the progressive historical development of the proletariat. They therefore endeavor, and that consistently, to deaden the class struggle and to reconcile the class antagonism. They still dream of experimental realization of their social utopias, of founding isolated pamphleters, of establishing home colonies, or setting up a little Icaria. Demo editions of the New Jerusalem, and to realize all the castles in the air, they are compelled to appeal to the feelings and purses of the bourgeois. By degrees, they sink into the category of the reactionary or conservative socialists depicted above, differing from these only by more sympathetic pandantry, pedantry, and by their fanatical and superstitious belief in the miraculous effect of their social science. They therefore violently oppose all political action on the part of working class. Such action, according to them, can only restrict from a blind belief in the new gospel. The own sites in England and the floristicists in France, respectively, oppose the Chartists and the Reformistes. Okay. Plamphisters were socialist colonies on the plan of Charles Fourier. Icara was the name given by the cabinet of his Utopia, and later on his American colony. Home colonies were what Owen called his communist model societies. Plamphisters was the name of the public palaces planned by Fourier. Icara was the name given to the utopian land of fantasy, whose communist institutions cabinet portrayed. Cabinet? Sure. IV. Positions of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. Section 2 made clear the relations of communists to the existing working class parties, such as the Chartists in England and the agrarian reformers in America. The communists fight for the attainment of the intermediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interest of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement. In France, the communist ally with the Social Democrats. There's a star. The party then represented in Parliament by Léon Rollin, in literature by Louis Blanc, in the daily press by the Reform, I don't really know. The name of social democracy signifies with these, its inventors, a section of the Democratic or Republican Party more or less tingled with socialism. Tinged with tingled? Tingled with socialism. No, tinged. In France, the communists allied with the Social Democrats against the conservative and radical bourgeoisie, reserving, however, the right to take up a critical position in regards to phases and illusions traditionally handed down from the Great Revolution. In Switzerland, they support the radicals without losing sight of the fact that this party consists of antagonistic elements, partly of democratic socialist in the French sense, partly of radical bourgeois. In Poland, they support the party that insists on the agrarian revolution as the prime condition for national emancipation, that party which fomented the insurrection of Krakow in 1846. Krakow. In Germany, they fight with the bourgeoisie whenever it acts in a revolutionary way against the absolute monarchy, the feudal squirearchy, and the petty bourgeoisie. But they never cease for a single instant to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, in order that the German workers may straightway use, as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie, the social and political conditions that bourgeoisie must necessarily introduce along with supremacy, and in that, after fall of reactionary classes in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. The communists turn their attention chiefly to Germany because that country is on the eve of a bourgeois revolution that is bound to be carried out under more advanced conditions of European civilization and with a much more developed proletariat than that of England was in the 17th, and France in the 18th century, and because the bourgeois revolution in Germany will be the prelude to an immediately following proletariat revolution. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front, as the leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. The communists disdain to congeal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite. Is this in the book? I don't know. Let me see. I have the book near me, just in case. 67. IV. Okay, blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay. Whoa, is that all? Wow. That is the Communist Manifesto. That was really short. This is, I have the book right here. That's all. Is there even a section 5? I swear there was. Ah. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, that's the Communist Manifesto. It took a few family interruptions and my reading, but that's all. This is all just extra stuff. This is not in the actual book. I guess this is just other stuff. But yeah, we're done. Under 2 hours, nice. Yeah. This has been the reading of the Communist Manifesto Party, written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, written in February 1848. And I will see you later.